for this training. We are going to be talking direct mail, the basics on how candidates and campaigns can develop mail, use this tactic and tool to target their messaging and reach their voters. It's a thing that we get asked on our political team quite frequently, and we want to be able to provide insight into the best practices that go into getting a mail piece from conception into mailboxes and in the hands of voters, especially as you get closer to an election. Those tuning in, you'll leave today with a pretty comprehensive understanding of the tactic, starting with how to develop a structured approach to developing mail pieces. What are the best practices and strategies to have success with this tactic? And even how you can utilize our team's resources and our tools to help you in every step of the way of this process. So I'm going to introduce, before we dive in, today's expert from our political team, Nate Allen, who is a campaign success manager at goodparty.org. And Nate, I'd love to kick it over to you to give a quick intro about who you are and what it is that you do for our team.
Yeah, hey everyone, good to meet you all. My name's Nate. Like Jared said, I'm a campaign success manager here at goodparty.org. So that's my main role. I just work directly with candidates, kind of giving basic advice, consulting, and then helping execute tactics like direct mailers, text messages, robocalls, stuff like that. I've worked in the alternative and independent political space for about 4 to 5 years now, from burgeoning third-party efforts to presidential campaigns, but most recently landed here and have been loving the work here at Good Party.
Thank you, Nate. Before we get started, for those who are tuning in live to this webinar, you should be able to post questions in the chat. We do have a dedicated session towards the end for Q&A. But if at any moment you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat. We'll take them live. We'll take them at the end. We want to make sure that we're covering every bit of ground that is related to this topic or others that are top of mind for our listeners. And so please be active. Please use the question chat room, and we'll make sure that we can answer your questions as they come in. But with that, let's dive in. And Nate, first question to you is, what exactly is direct mail? And specifically, why is it a frequently used and discussed tactic in political campaigns of all different shapes and sizes?
Yeah, so simply put, direct mailers are just a piece of literature, usually about a postcard size. Sometimes people do them as full letters that are sent directly via authorized postal delivery. And we'll kind of talk about what that means a little bit later on, basically to mailboxes or mail slots to the homes of voters. The reason that it's frequently used is it is a very effective form of outreach for a variety of reasons. One of those is that they are very tangible. So when you actually get a physical piece of mail, you get to hold it in your hands. You can put personal details on there, such as your story, obviously your name, and the issues that you're focusing on in your campaign. And so voters can actually hold that, see it, read it, share it with other people. So that's a good way to kind of spread the word. They're also generally viewed as kind of a less intrusive campaign tactic. That's compared to text messages or other forms of digital outreach sometimes. So a piece of mail kind of delivered by a familiar postal worker is expected, and there's kind of this layer of separation between you as the candidate and the voter, which is that postal service. So it feels like they get, their own space to take that information in and read it. Whereas a text message, maybe you are getting it directly from the candidate, and that might feel a little bit more unsolicited and unwelcome as a text message or a phone call. A couple other benefits here. You can also target specifically by household as opposed to by individual. So you can send one mailer to a family of 5 versus texting each member of that family individually. I think the biggest benefit this gives is that it can kind of spark conversation in the household. So instead of one person just getting a text and reading it, maybe replying with a question, you can actually start a conversation between everyone in the house. And that actually gets more name recognition because people are talking about you. Lastly, it may be more effective for populations who don't use their phones quite as much or don't see social media ads. So somebody who's still checking the mail, and it's a part of a lot of people's routine to go check the mail. It's something positive people like in their day. So they actually get to go out to a mailbox. That's part of their routine. They may take their dog with them, and then they get your piece of mail and actually get to read that. So it can be a positive association as opposed to one of those unsolicited text messages.
Yeah, I think everybody likes to get mail. It sounds like it's an old and quirky tactic relative to some of the high tech new ways that campaigns try and reach voters. But I think anyone who's been involved in politics has been interacted with by a voter who will like enthusiastically wave a postcard and be like, I got your mail. Like, I haven't checked my mailbox in so long, but thanks for reaching out that way. And it is just sort of a quirk of sort of being involved in campaigns. Is it's something that people both sometimes expect and are also excited to receive, even when they, didn't order something or anything like that. So we covered, I think, some of the pros that are associated with mail, but I'd like to dive in a little bit to some of the common challenges that candidates run into, because it is a tactic that I think our team working with candidates gets asked about a lot. It's not also as simple and straightforward in some instances as doing something like a text or a call. So I'd love to just talk a little bit about what is it that separates mail as maybe a tactic that some campaigns run into difficulty in getting out from start to finish.
Yeah, so it is a little bit less straightforward. Part of the reason is that it's a bit more resource intensive. So, mail requires a lot of organization and resources just to be able to get the campaign out the door. So a lot of like smaller campaigns may not be prepared for the types of things that you need to be thinking of, far in advance. You need to be planning out the people involved, the resources that you need, the budget, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're here for. We're here to let you know to start thinking about those things now. Oftentimes candidates find themselves juggling a lot of different things from trying to build a design, negotiate prices with a mail house, plan the messages, actually find that mail house, and then, create an audience out of voter data, figure out who you want to target and how you want to target them with specific messaging, and then kind of, working with that vendor to land everything, actually get it all put together, put into envelopes and out the door. So, um, and then, the other thing to consider here is budget. For these smaller campaigns, mail is often the largest line item in the budget. It'll often cost roughly about 50 cents per piece of mail, which is a lot more expensive than some other tactics like text messaging, and even robocalls. And then if you have to, hire design help or purchase voter data, stuff like that can actually make it even more expensive. So, you could text a voter almost 15 times at that price. So that is one thing that can be, restrictive for smaller campaigns. So the biggest thing to keep in mind there is you just have to prioritize and decide where that value add is. There's a lot of pros and cons for every tactic, and we'll talk about a little bit of those as we keep going.
That's a great point. I mean, I think that mail in many ways is this tactic that the more candidates sometimes learn about, especially towards the end of their campaigns, they sometimes steer away from realizing that there's a lot that goes into it. You named design, you have to have a mail house that is able to print and then send the mail pieces. And then in addition to all of that, there's just the general political strategy, right? Who are you going to send the piece to? When should you send it out? I'm curious a little bit specifically about, the audience targeting. You named that mail is distinct because you can send a piece of mail to a household versus, sending to every one targeted voter. So when you think about, doing a targeted mail strategy, what else are you thinking about in terms of audiences, like who to send it to, or when you should maybe even be sending a piece of mail?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things is considering, when ballots might be dropping. It's always a good time to actually send out mail pieces, or when early voting starts. You want to kind of get those pieces of mail in people's hands right around the time that they can take action shortly after that they read your mail piece. But as far as targeting goes, what you're really looking for is, specific pieces in the voter data that might indicate interest that people have or specific issues that they care about that might resonate with the issues that you're focusing on in your campaign. You might look at, age demographics, partisan affiliations to see who might be actually interested in the types of messaging that you're talking about. Specifically nonpartisan voters are always a good thing to look at as you run an independent campaign. So those kinds of things can help you, segment audiences and tailor your different messaging to each of those audiences.
That's something that we see a ton, right? Is when we're trying to point candidates in the direction of getting prepared for mail. And I want to talk about, how a campaign can get this organized, because unlike a text message campaign where this is something that we do a lot for candidates, they can send us a text through the product at goodparty.org, and we can get it out in anywhere from 2, 3 business days, sometimes even sooner. Mail, not always the case, right? There's a lot that goes into it that requires a bit of lead in time. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that, while goodparty.org itself isn't a mail house, there's a lot that our tool can do to help candidates prepare for that. And the biggest thing that I always point candidates towards is the custom voter files that allow for the file to be distributed in the mail format, right? And so sometimes we get candidates who are playing in Google Sheets for hours and hours trying to, figure out which voters are all living in the same house. And you can go right into our tool and save all of that time just by downloading the mail file, which is something that if you've never used before can be frustrating and take time to cure a voter list. But Nate, I want to talk about specifically, getting organized for someone who's never run a mail campaign before. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the steps that go into really getting organized and specifically how early should a candidate who wants to do mail start thinking about and preparing themselves to get a campaign off the ground?
Yeah, so the earlier is always better if you can get everything organized. Having to organize something that's as intensive as a direct mail campaign in the heart of campaign season can be pretty overwhelming. You're juggling going to events, doing other voter contact tactics, door knocking, fundraising, talking to volunteers. So the earlier the better. Sometimes we would recommend, up to 3 months in advance, trying to get some of these, individual pieces organized. But some of the things that we would recommend, or the requirements that we would want you to start thinking about now. One of those things is graphic design. So creating the design itself is actually the content of the mail piece. You want it to look good and look professional. So some of the things to consider there is if that's not something that's personally your skill set. I know it's not mine. I'm not a great graphic designer. Reach out to a friend who might be. Sometimes, if you can afford it, professional help can always be a well worthwhile investment to actually make that look very good rather than designed by somebody, who doesn't really know what they're doing and doesn't make it look quite as good. So definitely something good to consider there. Another thing is, we mentioned targeting a little bit, but you want to start thinking about specifically who you want to target. If you're taking a look at, the entire voter data list in your area, you might want to remove those people who don't frequently vote in the type of election that you're running in to save yourself some money. So it's always good to look at that kind of stuff when you identify the audience. Another thing is timing. So you really want to, stick the landing for an ideal mail piece so that it lands in post boxes at the precise moment. So you want to think about how long it's actually going to take to produce and ship from the mail house. So you want to talk to them specifically about how long it takes them to go through their process and actually get it in the mail. And you probably want to, plan to send that out, a couple days in advance of what they say they expect, just to make sure that it gets there on time. The worst thing is when a mail piece, lands the day after an election or a couple days later than you expected. Most people are going to return their ballots for early voting. So that's always something really important to consider. And then, just talk about the logistics with the mail house specifically. So, the stuffing and the labeling, the envelopes, that kind of stuff to make sure that they're going to do it in a way that you like. That kind of stuff can take a really long time if you wanted to do that yourself. So that's why it is good to reach out to a mail house, find someone that has a price that's agreeable to you. And try to offload some of that work so you can focus on some more important things in campaigning, like actually going out and talking to voters.
Thank you, Nate. And we do have a question on this from Erica, who is in your home state in Utah, where I think uniquely, or maybe not entirely uniquely, but a lot of ballots are shipped out to voters. And so I do want to talk about the best practice specifically of timing mail around votes in a second. But a question we get a lot is, well, does goodparty.org itself offer a mail option? Currently, it's not something that we offer the same way we do text messaging and robocalls for candidates. We are trying to make this a tactic that is accessible to candidates, at least in bits and pieces. And so what we'll do is first and foremost, the data is the foundation by which any tactic goes out. We make the voter data available in a way that is easy to use for a mail house that you maybe have identified. We also do have on our website a list of resources, not necessarily local mail houses. There are a lot of different companies and businesses that work nationally to try and make direct mail affordable and accessible for candidates. And we certainly encourage folks who are interested in doing the tactic to reach out to them. But oftentimes the best option is the local mail place, a local printer who also does postage. And Nate, I even to divert a little bit, how many times have you heard horror stories about campaigns who they're in California, but they use a Maryland-based mail house, and the postage is unreliable. And so can you talk a little bit even just about how much of a consideration timing is for that reason when you're picking your mail house, but also planning the time in which the piece goes out the door?
Yeah, so you want to consider how long it's going to take to ship a piece of mail from wherever it's actually going to be produced at. So, like Jared said, if it's going to be coming from across the country, not only is that going to take a long time, but there are all sorts of things that can come up that delay the delivery of it. Whether that's weather or anything else that happens in the chain of custody from the time it's printed to actually delivered by your local postal service. So it's always good to consider local options. What I always tell the candidates I'm working with is take a look at some of the vendors that do national shipping and that might have really good prices, but always compare with a local vendor. Another thing you can always boast is that you've worked with a local vendor, and that makes you look good in a local campaign. And you can also always like earn votes or earn a place to put up a poster if you make a good connection with a local vendor. So those kinds of things are always important to consider in local community races.
Yeah, we'll talk about best practices in a moment, but I've had many instances where in my past life in running campaigns, we would vet a mail house. And this is an important question for any candidates who are planning on doing mail and maybe are using a local printer, is how long does it take you to deliver the final piece to the post office even to be shipped? And it's important when you're thinking out mail to not just time it out to when voters are going to receive it, but also how close and how much time do you have in relation to your election day. And the worst case scenario, right, is you plan out a mail piece to land the Tuesday of an election, and then the election passes. In the days that follow, you start getting messages like, "Hey, I just received your mailer on Thursday." Too late at that point. And so we will certainly talk about best practices because I think there's plenty to go into on mail, but we will not be able to reiterate enough like it's not a tactic that can be distributed with the snap of a finger. And so the lead in time is really, really important to make sure that you're not, sending postcards to people 2 days after the election, or even putting yourself in a position where you'll feel anxious about is the mail going to arrive in time? Because everyone knows sometimes the USPS is not the most not to throw shade, but not the most reliable, and consistent thing in the world. And so that's a huge consideration: is are you setting yourself up for success just when you plan on having it hit homes? Nate, I'd also like to talk a little bit more about calls to action. And it's something that when you look at a text message or on a website or social media copy, we're always hammering that home to candidates, but mail pieces are pretty distinct in that, again, you have something tangible. So can you talk a little bit about what some of the best practices are with a piece of mail that can help a candidate really drive people somewhere or measure the success of their piece?
Yeah, so a call to action for anyone who's not familiar with the terminology is just a direct ask at the end of a piece of content that you've put out. So oftentimes if we're, scrolling an email, we'll have that big button that people can click that says, donate here, volunteer here, check out my issue, something like that. Well, on a mail piece, obviously that's not directly interactable, but you can still have a link to a website, or one thing I always suggest is put a QR code. Makes it really easy to actually scan on a hard piece of paper. And actually, I actually think it's really nice to scan a QR code on a physical piece of mail as opposed to doing it off of a phone or something like that. So those kinds of things can actually make it exciting. People sometimes see QR codes and just instinctually pull out their phone and want to scan it. So you can still put strong calls to action. As you walk through the issues on your mailer, you can also end with just an ask to say, if you care about these, would you mind donating or would you mind volunteering? So those things can be very strong. Usually, again, I would put that at kind of like the bottom after they've read the key issues that you're focused on and your key messaging. And oftentimes it can also be used to invite people to a local event that you're hosting. So if you time those mailers just right, you can be hosting, a town hall the next week where you're going to talk to everybody in the neighborhood about your issues and try to recruit volunteers and donors. And you can include an invitation on the bottom of that mailer to let people know, what's going on. Another thing is, around get out the vote time. That's in the last couple of weeks of the campaign where you're really encouraging people to actually come out to vote, come out to the polls. You can let them know where their local polling location is, when election day is, when voting times for the polls are. So all of that stuff can fall under that umbrella of a call to action and can be really useful at the bottom of a mailer.
I love specifically diving into things like CTAs because when someone receives something physical in their hands, I think there's a degree of trust that maybe isn't, in a day and age where phishing or spam is a consideration on people's minds. I don't think mail runs into that specific problem, right? If you receive an email or a text message that you don't necessarily recognize, you might not be as inclined to click that link and go to that web page. But with
Yeah.
mail, you can see the family of the candidate, everyone's smiling, everyone's putting on a good face, and it says, "Please visit our website." I think that you'll find more success in driving people to a destination. And so my follow-up question to you is how can a candidate measure whether or not their campaign was even successful based on the CTAs that you just described?
Yeah, so there are a few things that you can consider tracking here. One of the biggest things is website views. So you can take a look on most website providers, they're going to have the ability for you to track on a simple graph when people actually visited your website. And so if you know when that mailer is landing, you can actually see whether or not website traffic increased on that day. And that way you know that your mailer is effective. A/B testing, where you test two different versions at once, is also a good thing to consider here, where you might send out multiple versions of mailers to the same population, or you might have different messages to different populations that land on, a couple days apart from each other, where you can start to test which messaging is actually landing better with populations and converting to those actual engagements on a website. And then you can tailor that messaging as you go out and talk to people in public based on which one actually landed better. So not only is it an effective campaign tactic in itself, that can actually inform better campaign tactics in the future. But there are a couple other ways that you can track this as well. The number of donations that you got, especially if your call to action was around donations, you can see if donations ticked up during that time. And the same thing for volunteer signups. If people, if specifically you said, I need door knockers, please sign up to volunteer. If you got, more volunteer signups on your website, form submissions, that kind of stuff, all of those things are a good indicator of whether or not your mailer is actually effective.
I love, again, I think that that's not something that can be overstated. And it's something that for those candidates who are listening, who are considering mail, before you send anything out, right, it's so important that you know how you're tracking success. And so to Nate's point, if it's website views, if it's fundraising contributions that may come in or social media followers, whatever it might be, knowing exactly what that is and then thinking about what you're asking people who receive this mailer to do, you have to be able to know whether or not it's successful, which means measuring something. And I think sometimes when we see candidates who are disappointed in the performance of their mail piece, it's because they sort of generically will say, well, I expected more. But without knowing what you're measuring, it's hard to align expectations on what is, reasonable or likely to happen. And I think candidates who do pieces of mail oftentimes will report back, oh my God, like my website traffic spiked. And it was timed exactly when the mailers hit the households. And that leads into a question that we were asked specifically about websites from Wes in Nebraska, which is, well, how do we, link these two tactics? How do you connect the dots to make sure that you even have a website? And I want to tee you up in that there, Nate, because we have some news recently from goodparty.org in terms of a feature that was released that I think is really relevant and would love for you to answer the basic question of what's been new on the website front in this organization's purview.
Yeah, so we're super excited to announce that we've rolled out a new website builder feature on the dashboard of goodparty.org. So when you sign up and get into your pro membership, you'll actually see that you can create a website landing page. So we know that websites can be complicated for a lot of candidates who are just starting out. It's an additional thing that you have to think of on top of everything else that you're dealing with. Well, the biggest benefit here is that we make it really easy. It's like a 5 or 6 click process to get that set up. It's a very simple but pleasing looking design that has everything that you need, an issue or a location for you to put your issues, and a location for people to actually go and learn about you as a candidate. We offer that as part of the pro subscription. So you just go onto your dashboard and you can actually just use that without an additional cost. But we do also have the ability for you to switch that design over to your own custom domain if you want to buy a domain and just move that right over. So we've made the whole web design part less complex and confusing and really easy for you to get that out of the way, direct people there on your calls to action, and then get on with everything else that you want to focus on in your campaign.
We're really excited about that. I think that these two tactics in particular are deeply connected, and I would certainly recommend that a candidate or a campaign has a place to point people before they do any tactic like mail or even texting indoors. So to be able to say, please visit my website is frankly something that a lot of our candidates weren't able to do until this tool was released. For those who are listening, who are running for office, who don't already have a website, we really encourage you to take a look. Like Nate said, it's easy to build. And once you do that, you'll be able to point people in a certain direction. And that in many ways ties back to this topic of direct mail. So to
Oh,
summarize, go
Jared,
ahead.
I actually have one correction, and it's a piece of very good news. The website builder is actually open to everyone. So you don't even have to be pro. If you need a website for your campaign, we will help you set one up. Obviously, it's a lot more effective when you can start pushing people to it with your mail, with your texts, with everything. So, as always, pro is going to be valuable for you, but we wanted to make sure that as many people as possible out of the independents that we work with can have a professional looking website to kind of up their campaign game.
Thank you, Tevin. You heard it direct from the source. Any goodparty.org candidate can have a website now. We encourage you to do it. And in so many ways, it's going to level up your campaign's ability to reach people and build a presence both online and in person. And so, Nate, to summarize sort of the discussion around tactics and effectiveness of mail, what I heard was one, it's incredibly important to get organized around key dates, to identify the pieces of the puzzle early so that the campaign has a lot of time to be able to get everything organized and get the vendor identified and get things out the door in times that mail doesn't arrive late, and to have a means of tracking effectiveness. But one thing I'd like to talk about specifically for a candidate who is thinking about mail like in the middle of August, right? Maybe they have a November election. When would be the time to really go heads down in full sprint to be able to get this piece of mail or pieces of mail even out to the vendor? I think you said 3 months. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that means and why so early relative to a November election?
Yeah, so, I've mentioned that it's a complex process. I just think it's good to get the ball rolling early on. You're going to encounter some, roadblocks and obstacles to get through on anything that you're doing in a campaign. Things can go crazy. So it's good to get that ball rolling early and start thinking about all the pieces. That way, when by the time that you land it, you have plenty of runway, plenty of cushion to know that you've gotten it to the mail house in time and can actually get it out in time. 3 months is a great time to start thinking about it. So if you have a November election right now is an awesome time to start thinking about it. Doesn't mean that you necessarily have to get all the information to them at 3 months. If you don't, get the information to them in the next week, it's not the end of the day. You still have plenty of time to get that to them. But now's a good time to start thinking about it. It gives you time to lock in the pricing and ask the questions that we were talking about, such as, are they going to help with the design? Some mail houses even help with that. You can ask them what the cost per piece is and what their process is, whether or not they can manage it, the entire service for you. But ideally, you also want to be planning multiple mailers at a single time, and then send everything up front to that mail house well in advance. So, like I mentioned earlier, if you're A/B testing or you're sending different versions to different populations, you're gonna need some time to plan out all of the messaging and all the designs for each pieces of those. So it's good to start thinking about that in advance and then get that all sent off, a couple of months at least in advance before you start getting into crazy campaign season. I think that most candidates we work with, especially first timers, tend to underestimate how busy you're going to be in that last month or 6 weeks leading up to an election, where all of a sudden people start realizing, I got to go out and knock doors and I got to organize these community events. I have, a town hall to participate in to answer some questions. So try to do yourself a favor and get that out of the way. At the very least, what we suggest, sometimes you're going to come down to those last few weeks of a campaign, realizing you still need to get something out the door. What I would recommend is just getting designs and data to the mail house with a full sign off no less than 10 days before the date that you expect those to actually drop in the mailboxes. So that gives you a pretty good window, 3 months if you're really starting to prepare, and 10 days at the very least, and try to aim somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah, I think 10 days is certainly I've been personally burned going much closer than that. I generally like to get everything in one drop to the mailer early. So to elaborate, I mean, my recommendation to candidates typically is around Labor Day. And what you can do when that happens is you can have the mail house print everything all at once. And these are little tricks of the trade to find savings, right? If you send, 1,000 pieces of mail one day and then maybe 500 the next day and 750 the week after that, the piece might become more expensive because this person has to, run their printer every single time you send them that. So the idea is do it as much as you can all in one shot, and hopefully it can reduce the costs. And we harp on the costs of mail because it is much more expensive. Like Nate said, for the cost of one piece of mail, you can conceivably send about 15 texts to the same voter, which is not what we would necessarily recommend, but there is a significant difference in costs there. And so, Nate, I'd love to poke a little bit more at, well, for a cost conscientious candidate, which I think most of us, if not all of us, are, or candidates who are worried about the cost associated with mail, what other tactics are there to maybe find savings, and how can you make this piece of political campaigning more tangible for some?
Yeah, so it's good to consider the trade-offs for sure. So, if you want to send multiple mailers, but you're realizing that your budget's going to be a little bit constrained, it might still be advantageous for you to only send one and then pair that with a text message and some social media advertising. And if you do plan to only send one mailer out, some considerations there are when it's actually going to be most effective. If you had the biggest budget in the world, you might send three over the course of 2.5 months. But if you only have one, you're probably going to want to drop that as close to election day, or at least like when polls open for early voting as possible, so that you land it at the most opportune time. You're getting the biggest bang for your buck. And then, of course, like I said, it's kind of balancing those trade-offs. So if you have a certain budget, again, you might do a couple of text messages and one mailer as opposed to two mailers and putting yourself over budget. We would definitely recommend that you don't only use mailing as your only voter tactic. Text messages and robocalls are very effective and something that you can always consider, especially door knocking, community events, when you get in person and actually talk to voters. That can be very, very beneficial. So if you only have the budget to send, two mailers, think about how you can maybe just do one and then pair it with a couple other tactics so that you reach all types of voters. Earlier I mentioned that, mailers can be very good for targeting people who might not be quite as in the digital world, but a lot of people are in that digital world. So you want to hit both fronts instead of just focusing everything on mailers because you feel like that's what you have to do.
Yeah, it's one of many tactics that we always will try and marry together, and for us, texts and robocalls are the things that we lean heavily into. And I think that part of this is also you can reach different audiences with different tactics. And so budget is always the driver here. I think many campaigns structure their budget specifically around mail because it is more fixed. The other thing to discuss is even just how do you make the process more manageable so that you don't have to necessarily rely on a mail house to do everything. And I think for those who are thinking about it, Nate, I'd love to tee you in on this too, but what are the pieces of the process that maybe you can pull someone else into to drive down your costs of cost per piece, let's say?
Yeah, so I kind of teased at this a little bit earlier, but a lot of people know graphic designers or have a friend who is an artist or does some kind of design, or at least is like proficient in Canva, which is a free software that you can use online. So stuff like that can actually make it a lot easier and a lot more affordable to get the design set up and get everything planned out. If you're really crunched on budget, there's also the ability to, call a few friends, have a party where you all get everything printed, bring it to your house, and then you stuff all the envelopes together and then go take that to the mail yourself. So you don't have to hire a professional mail house to do everything. It doesn't make it a lot easier and less complex, absolutely. But it doesn't mean that it has to be the most stressful thing to manage some of those individual pieces by yourself. It's definitely possible to save some money in the budget, and you can still execute that tactic while saving money for some other stuff as well.
That's one of my favorite like volunteer mobilization tasks is when, especially if you don't, the campaign is coming to an end, maybe you don't have enough fuel in the tank to do another mail piece. When we talk about mail, we're almost always saying, do a postcard with the big family portrait and a bunch of reasons why you're running. But one of the best practices that I've had, and Nate, I'd be curious if you have had similar, experiences with sort of volunteer mail organizing. We used to do things like, will you vote for me cards, where we would send them out to volunteers and people who are known in the community. And then they'd fill them out and send them out to friends or just ship them off to other volunteers and say, hey, here's why I'm voting for this candidate. That is using mail in a way that doesn't require, a full mass printing, mass designing, direct them to a website type of operation, but it is a similar tactic and a more affordable way when you're sort of using the power of people to stuff envelopes and not have to run a big massive printing operation. That only works in really small sizes, but it is an opportunity to get mail out the door when you can't necessarily afford the mass produced postcard.
Yeah, and that's obviously a super fun way to do it. It has that added benefit of actually, sparking a small little social movement as you run your campaign where it kind of spreads out like wildfire, where you initially reach out to your network and then they spread out to their network. And, that's old school organizing where you actually build from the ground up and actually start talking to your connections that you have. You don't have to worry about uh, you know, perfect targeting and voter data. You just spread out naturally where your message lands. So I think that's a great idea as well.
I do want to touch on additional best practices, but before we dive into best practices, there's one thing that I think we hear oftentimes, and it's important that any candidate on this call or those who've thought about this better understands maybe some of the common mistakes to avoid and how to not step in the pitfalls. So, Nate, I'd love if you can double click on the idea of what should a candidate avoid doing to try and get gimmicky with direct mail.
Sure. Yeah, well, I mentioned the one earlier, don't spend all of your money on one piece of mail or on mail in general, kind of spread it out. So that's always a good one to consider. But I think the most important thing that we'd love to drive home about this, sometimes people try to get really creative, come up with this novel solution of trying to cut out the actual mail out of mailers and try to deliver mailers yourself. You can mobilize a bunch of people ride up and down the sidewalks on your bikes and put mail in mailboxes yourself. And it sounds like a great way to save some money because, stamps can be expensive. But to drive home, like, please do not do this. It's actually very, very, very illegal to put mail in mailboxes. It's only allowed for the post office to do this. So if you get caught, it's actually a massive fine per individual piece of mail. So if you're trying to save budget, definitely not the way to do it. Still pay for those stamps. It's way more worth it than risking those fines. So don't fall in that pitfall. But there, as we mentioned, there's some other ways that you can save money for sure. Additionally, if you do want to take that tactic, one thing that you can do is instead of doing traditional mailers, what you can do is door hangers, where you can just hang a piece of literature on somebody's door hanger or a palm card. When you go out to events or in-person community events, you can hand those directly to people as you meet them. Still a great way to distribute your information and a physical piece of literature across the population without having to risk any illegal pitfalls.
Yes, I will absolutely emphasize only authorized postal workers are able to deliver mail to people's households. And I think if we had a nickel for every time the idea has come up, we'd have, I don't know how many nickels, but we'd have plenty. And it's something that it's a really unfortunate thing in the event that that advice isn't adhered to and candidates start to drop things directly in people's post mail door hangers or postcards that you can slip, in the cracks of a door. Essentially the same thing, but you don't expose yourself to any issues there.
Yeah,
Um,
that's always quite a startle to hear from a candidate that they've already been doing this. So we're trying to catch you guys in advance. I had a candidate one time really excitedly tell me that he had, his kids ride their scooters around the neighborhood and put stuff in mailboxes. And at that point, it's too late. So I just didn't tell him. But yeah, try to avoid that if you can.
I will get into I want to get into Q&A in a few minutes here, and if you do have questions, please throw them into the chat. We want to talk about mail. If there anything even more general in the campaign that is related to get out the vote, we're here. We want to answer any and all questions that you have. There was one question that came in, Nate, from Adrian, who said that when you are running in an election, maybe where there's a lot of candidates, especially incumbents, sometimes who are better funded, and everybody is doing mail, how do you stand out and maximize the tactics so that you don't spend a lot of money on a piece of postage that's going to go right into the garbage?
Sure, yeah. So if you still are determined to do mail, like we said earlier, try to time it just right. Try to make your design look really good and kind of stand out in that way. But I think mail is one of those more traditional tactics. And so, a way that you can stand out is by doing some of these other things like text messages. Personally, I don't think I've ever received a text message from a candidate in a local race. So if you're one of those first time for people that they actually get a text message, that can stand out quite a bit and be an effective way to campaign, and it's effective budget wise as well, so it's a good way to stand out in that kind of race.
Yeah, I would say I would double down on it. The mail pieces that are the most memorable are the ones where the person who's receiving it doesn't think to themselves, who is this? I've never heard of them before. And so, as part of a strategy, I certainly wouldn't say, hey, the mail is the exact first thing you should be doing, because it ensures that you're starting from a place of limited familiarity. And so, whether that's building up your presence on social, sending out a text, a call, whatever it is, you can use mail as a follow-up piece and do it in a way that is hopefully going to be geared to having some familiarity already built in. Someone will look at it and say, oh, I recognize the name, I recognize the face. What a pretty family they have. Maybe I'll go to their website and check this person out more seriously. Floor is certainly open. We'd love, again, if you have questions, post them in the chat, throw them into Circle. We'll touch on them here. Nate, I do want to talk a little bit about other, maybe best practices, whether it's message, whether it is novel tactics that you have seen in the realm of mail, that if you were to say, hey, I've got one shot to really make an impression with this tactic, you would recommend all candidates to consider. And then we can pivot to the Q&A.
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I drive home is just really know your audience by using voter data. And of course, you go to goodparty.org, go to our dashboard, and you can get some good segmented voter data specifically for the populations that you're looking for. So one of the things on knowing your audience is just know who they are, what they value, and how they prefer to be communicated with. So again, age can be a big factor here. So if it's a younger voter who's like a first time voter, maybe a text message is going to be a little bit better for them, and you don't have to worry about spending budget on sending a mailer. But middle-aged voters, older voters, they're more used to getting these types of campaign tactics and don't want those things that might feel a little bit more intrusive to them. So know those people, target them with those mailers. That can be really big. Use voter data to segment your audience and kind of personalize the message to each target demographic as well can be really useful. So personalization can go beyond just addressing the recipient by their name on the mailer, but you can also tailor the content to any interests that are pointed out and the voter data, pain points, issues that they're concerned about. And then if you've happened to have any past interactions with anybody on the list, those kinds of things can make a big difference as well. One tactic that I've seen people do that I think really works is, writing little personal notes or handwriting things on the back of mailers. Can be time intensive. Again, a good opportunity to get some volunteers together for a little party to write those personal notes. But those types of things really make it feel like the candidate has reached out to you as a voter in a personal way and actually cares about you and what you think. So they can look at it, see personal handwriting, and think, okay, this person put in time to actually reach out to me. So those kinds of things can actually make a huge difference compared to just getting a nice printed piece of mail. The other thing that I would recommend is, design and the aesthetic element of a design is really important, but you also want your message to be communicated very quickly and effectively. It should be clear and concise to the point. So focus on issues that matter most to your audience. Don't have huge walls of text that people have to read. Use bullet points that people can read the key issues that you care about. And then use that verifiable data from voter data, and then a specific plan to show how you're going to address the issues that those people care about that you found out from the voter data. So again, create bullet points, headlines to make your key points stand out, but don't go too in depth. Give people, an opportunity to have a little bit of a question so that they can engage with your call to action, go to your website, reach out to you on your contact form. Those kinds of things can make a huge difference.
That's a good one to double click on, is just the use of bullet points. I think that sometimes you see a design and think, oh my God, I have so much space. But in reality, most postcards are not so big. And so I would emphasize using bullet points is a really just common and best practice. You don't have to write a paragraph, you don't have to write an essay. It should be clear, it should be concise. And the whole point of the mail piece is for someone to gain recognition of your campaign. So make sure that they're seeing your name emphasized, because that's what they're going to see on a ballot, and that they are pointed to a direction where they can learn more, whether it's a website or a social media page. Another best practice I always found is, and this is why we always recommend candidates get started early, is using recognizable imagery. It doesn't have to be a professional headshot. I think a lot of times candidates will say, oh my God, I'm spending money on a postcard, I have to be, straight backed with a suit and tie on. And in reality, being out in the community, if someone gets a picture of some place that they recognize and you're in there, I think that they find that'll be a more engaging, piece of mail and piece of content, because they'll say, oh, I recognize that place. This is my hometown. This is my community. They'll be more inclined to, not treat it as something that is maybe spammy or confusing to them. We had another question here around, well, I think specifically in regards to, Nate, your idea of, writing personal notes on a piece of mail and then sending it out. So how exactly would that work? Can you walk through that tactic specifically?
Yeah, so what the process looks like is typically you're going to get those printed out and then, take them home, and then you're going to, one by one go through those and actually write them out. There are some people will make like a stamp of a message. I think that's a little less personal, but still more personal than not doing anything, can save you some time. But typically what I've seen people do is they'll get a group of, 5, 10 volunteers all sitting around for a couple of hours, and one by one they'll write something on there, put them in a pile. And then if you're doing that process where you're stuffing the envelopes yourself and putting a stamp on them, you can kind of create a quick assembly line to make that happen. So buy your volunteers some pizza and then some soda and make a good night out of it. But if you don't want to do that part, it can still just be writing those personal notes, and then you're going to go ahead and drop those off to a place that's actually going to envelope, package, and send them out for you.
Yeah, it's a tactic I love. Being able to, give something a little bit personal, something that people recognize. I think that there is an element here where someone will, you want them to have a reaction. They'll say, oh, this person thought enough about me to put their own writing on this piece of postage and address it to me personally. Any other best practices or tips, Nate, that if you were saying, hey, this is the time, we got 1 week, or sorry, I should say more than 10 days to go in a campaign. We're throwing a Hail Mary out with a piece of direct mail. What have you seen be effective in driving turnout?
Yeah, I think, one thing I mentioned earlier is having a strong call to action around actually going out to vote, let people know where their polling places are. Some areas, and definitely look into the laws in your area on this, but some areas will allow you to offer like rides to polling places. So you can offer that on a mailer and say, reach out to this email if you need a ride to the polling place so you can vote this day. And that gives you, a good opportunity on that ride to connect with them over the issues that you care about and talk to them about hopefully voting for you. But some other things around the design that can be important as well include images that evoke emotion and kind of align with your message. So everyone knows like the famous commercial about the dogs that that need to be adopted and look really sad, like that kind of idea with whatever, your message is going to be, might do very well to evoke emotion, get people, emotionally invested in the types of things that you're talking about, or make them recall that they already do care about this, and bring it to the forefront of their mind. So that can be really beneficial. Jared's alluded to this next one a little bit, but real images of yourself, your family, your campaign team, and voters that you've talked to in the area, a picture of you talking to them with your thumb up, those kind of images can always, make it look like you're actually active in the community. If you have a bunch of volunteers, a picture of you with your team of 10, 20 volunteers in a room can, really show that you're not just a single person who decided to run and thinks that you're best for the job. You're actually somebody who has backing, people that support you and genuinely think that you would be best for the job, and can make people actually feel more confident voting for you. So those pictures of you actually in the community and engaging with voters can be really powerful.
I think we have not discussed, and there's a question around endorsements, and specifically how can a candidate communicate endorsements that they've received via mail, and can other organizations even be involved in sort of the creation of mail pieces specifically on behalf of or with the support of a campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it doesn't have to take up your entire design, but if you've been endorsed by, an organization or somebody who's well known in the community, you can put like a stamp of approval on the side, next to the words that you've listed on there to show that you've been endorsed by people in the community. Those kinds of things can add an air of legitimacy to your campaign. Other organizations can definitely, independently spend if they want to support you, and put out, their own piece of mail that talks about the issues that they care about, and then mention that, they actually support you and like what you're doing as a candidate, and that, they can suggest that you might actually be the best person to solve the issues that are already on their mailing list. So they might have data that's separate from voter data for first-time voters or someone else in their communities that can really matter. Yeah, another thing that can be really helpful there for different places in the community is to consider writing them in different languages. So if you have, a big Spanish speaking population in the area, it can be really good to invest in someone that can accurately translate, make sure it's in natural language. Don't just use Google Translate. Sometimes, that can actually be worse than not sending it at all, because they can tell what you did. So, natural language, find someone who actually speaks that language to translate it for you, and that, actually supports your campaign. And then you can send that out to people in different parts of the community, talk about the issues that they care about as well.
I like that you touched on, I was about to jump in and say one best practice for doing mailers in a language that maybe you don't speak is to not rely on a translation app. And I think it ties to the authenticity of the tactic, right? If you're a candidate and you want to reach Spanish speaking voters, you want to do it in a way that feels authentic to you and to the purpose of reaching out to a Spanish speaking community. And the least authentic way to do that is to broadcast and advertise that you are pretending to speak their language. And so, doing so in a way that is, first and foremost grounded in real proper use of a foreign language is an important tactic. I've also seen candidates target communities where maybe English is the second language in English, but the idea is to talk about the issues that they perceive matter to that community in a way that is, again, more authentic. So that is not to say that if you don't speak Spanish or you don't speak French or any other language, you can't try to recruit people to help communicate that to other communities, but you don't want to step in it and then seem like you're trying kind of pandering in a way that is going to do more harm than good.
Yeah, and it's a good opportunity to double up on both of those tactics and maybe find a community leader in that area that might be willing to endorse you, and then they can actually write a message themselves on a mailer that you're going to send to that area, in that language. So you can kind of hit two birds with one stone there.
Well, we are coming to the end of our program. I do want to do a last call for questions we want to touch on and make sure everyone, leaves here with an understanding of how to take actionable next steps if you're interested in pursuing mail as a tactic. Again, we acknowledge it's a bit of a quirky one for us because it is not something that, we wish we could just run to the printer and produce a whole lot of mail pieces for our candidates. It's certainly not something that we presently offer. But we do understand that it's an important piece of campaigning. And I think that for folks who are thinking about mail as a tactic, the purpose of these trainings more than anything is to help candidates get informed on the best practices, the realities of touching all different elements of a political campaign. And so for us, the goal is to answer questions, to make sure folks who are on this call, who are listening, feel really empowered to be able to reach their voters in the means and with the reach that they need to have success. And so please fire away at us. We're happy to answer any and all questions that you may have. We'll do a last call, but Nate, any closing thoughts before we sign off on mail and how it can fit into the campaign's arsenal?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've hit all of the main pieces here, but just to reiterate a couple of things, a very useful campaign tactic, definitely mix it in with other tactics. Consider good design, consider messaging, who you're going to be targeting to. Don't deliver it to yourself into mailboxes to other people in the area. But consider using voter data on goodparty.org. Have a strong call to action. So just a recap of all those points.
I think we have one more question, which is how effective are mailers as opposed to other campaign tactics, which is a great question. How do they compare?
Yeah, so I think that's going to depend on the area and the campaign that you run. But I think that it really depends on the audience that you're targeting. So, for instance, again, if you're targeting younger voters, a text message is going to be a little bit more effective, but mailers can be very effective for some older voters. We also know that older voters typically vote more frequently, especially in local races. So that can be particularly effective in those types of races if you're running in like a city council race or a mayoral race. So, we mentioned earlier ways to track those the effectiveness of each of those things. So especially if you're starting out early in the campaign, you send out your first mailer and your first text message, it's good to A/B test yourself and see which one's going to be more effective and a better place for you to put money in your specific campaign as you go on.
And I want to add, our team, the political folks on this call, myself, Nate, the other members who work directly with candidates, we are always happy to provide feedback. We're always happy to provide insight. We've all sent, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of postcards over the course of our careers. And so if anyone has any questions about what an effective mailer looks like, just like you would have questions about an effective text or an effective website, we're always happy to review, provide feedback, and try and point our candidates in the right direction to make sure that they're, getting the highest and best use out of the experience. I would touch on one additional thing when you're thinking about tactics specifically, is mail is a piece of the arsenal, not necessarily the entire tool. And so you may want to, like Nate said, text young voters, call older voters, mail certain segments of the population. The other thing to think about is where do people live, and am I getting sort of the maximum reach out of this tactic in particular? And so some experiences that I've seen personally, if you're mailing young people, they may not even be receiving the mail because it may not be a permanent address for them, or they may be off at school, for example. An 18-year-old who might be in college, you may be sending a piece of mail to their home address and they may not even be there at all. On the other side, sending a direct mail card to an apartment building might be a really effective strategy, knowing you can't door knock there. And so there's sort of the realistic and pragmatic pros and cons to each tactic that will help people winnow down who they should be sending mail to versus who they should be texting versus who they should be robocalling. And to tie a really nice knot around all of it, that's exactly why we have these conversations now in August, because it gives you an opportunity to flesh things out and not feel like you are, putting your foot on the gas, but not clear which direction you should be driving in when it gets to be heads down time after Labor Day. We had a question around if you were to not choose mailers, would it make it much more difficult to reach like a medium-sized population, let's say a town of 20, 30,000 people? Nate, I'll turn that over to you. Like, how effective are the alternatives to mail at reaching voters?
Yeah, so I don't know that it makes it that much more difficult to reach people. I think it just depends on what's going to be most effective for each segment of the population. So that's always a consideration there. One other piece to consider, though, is that we don't always have mobile phone numbers for texting for everyone in the population or landline phone numbers for robocalls. So we always, in voter data, if we have an existing record of that person, always or almost always we have an address associated with that record. So mailers are always a much more accessible way to reach pretty much every voter that we do have information on.
It's the pros and it's the cons. The pros are that you know exactly where you're sending out to. And again, I think the biggest sort of drawback, as we've discussed, is it can be expensive. And we got a question around sort of what is the built-in cost of a piece of mail. Generally, as a fun fact, first class or political mail is almost always, if not always, first class mail. So the postage generally is on its own roughly 30 cents per piece. Then you have associated printing costs. If there are design costs, that's generally how you can get into the 50-cent range per pieces of mail. Any last questions from this group?
I did see a question come in, can Good Party Review design or provide templates? We don't necessarily have templates, but if you are signed up for a pro membership, you'll have somebody available that will be working with you on your campaign, and we're always happy to look at designs and give our thoughts on it.
Well, thank you everybody for the questions. Thank you everyone for joining and attending and coming to learn about mail from our group. If you ever have any questions at all, again, we're here to be helpful and look forward to seeing mail pieces for review. Look forward to being able to help candidates get pointed in the right direction. And more than anything, this is all part of helping candidates win, which we're, as an entire organization, here to be able to help folks with. So don't be strangers. We're here to help, and wishing everybody a very, very good rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.